Unicorn Warriors Eternal is a new show developed for Adult Swim by Genndy Tartakovsky, not to be confused with the Spanish-French movie called Unicorn Wars that came out in 2022. If you don't know who the creator is, which I would find somewhat unlikely for viewers of this channel, Tartakovsky is the animation legend behind projects such as Samurai Jack, Dexter's Laboratory, Primal, Symbiotic Titan, Star Wars Clone Wars, and the Hotel Transylvania movies. One of my biggest regrets on this channel last year was not doing a first thoughts video on the first 2 seasons of Primal, which I personally believe to be the best show that Adult Swim has aired in years. Granted, I didn't know I would be doing so much Adult Swim content at the time, but regardless, the quality of the show is so high that I should have talked about it anyway, and I eventually will. In any case, when I heard that a new series from Tartakovsky was coming to the network in 2023, I knew I had to cover it to make up for my previous mistake. To give you a basic rundown of a show with a very complicated premise, the story follows a group of heroes known as the Order of the Unicorn, who must fight a mysterious evil spirit. The team was formed in medieval times by Merlin the Wizard, and is comprised of Melinda, the Sorceress, Seng, the Cosmic Monk, and Eldred, the Elf Warrior. After a fight in ancient Egypt, Merlin seals the heroes' spirits away in a robot named Copernicus, who will reawaken them as soon as the evil entity returns to the world. Years later, in the late 1800s, the souls of Melinda, Seng, and Eldred are awakened and transported into the bodies of 3 London residents known as Emma, Alfie, and Dimitri. Now, the heroes must fight the lurking threat while dealing with 2 souls within the same bodies, leading to conflicting personality traits and scattered memories. Unicorn Warriors Eternal is apparently a lifelong passion project for Tartakovsky, as he originally started pitching the show to various studios during his early days at Cartoon Network. Over 20 years later, the network finally picked up the program to be part of their Acme Night block, but eventually moved it over to Adult Swim, with the first 2 episodes airing on May 5th, 2023. Given the show is pretty high concept, I can sort of see why there was some reluctance for it to be picked up by the network initially. However, with the overwhelming success of Primal, Samurai Jack, and everything else he's done, it doesn't surprise me they're willing to take a gamble when it comes to Tartakovsky's projects at this point. If only Sony Pictures Animation had the same mentality, and then the Popeye movie he was working on might have been finished. Speaking of Popeye, Unicorn Warriors Eternal, visually speaking, pays a lot of homage to classic animators including Walt Disney, Hayao Miyazaki, Osamu Tezuka, and the Fleischer Brothers. The setting is a steampunk reimagining of England in 1890. I know a lot of people go crazy over steampunk, and I like it too when it's done well. Thankfully, Unicorn Warriors Eternal seems to take inspiration from some of my favorite steampunk settings, such as Future Boy Conan or Tezuka's Metropolis. So here we have an animation juggernaut taking inspiration from many other animation juggernauts that give the show a cross between 2 aesthetics, those being classic cartoons and classic anime. This is especially true with the character designs, which at times feel like they're lifted right out of an Astro Boy manga or a Betty Boop cartoon. It feels familiar, but it's also fresh, combining 2 different visual styles that were both popular around the same time, but in 2 very different sides of the world. Everything from the backgrounds, to the lighting, to the color palette, to the character and creature designs all look so breathtaking. Where it obviously gets the chance to shine the most is during the beautiful action sequences, which are thrilling and extremely engaging. I have literally no complaints when it comes to anything this show does in the visual department. Unicorn Warriors Eternal not only looks fresh, but also attempts to be original in terms of its storytelling. In an interview, Tartakovsky explained that due to his continued inability to get the show greenlit, many of the early concepts for the series were scrapped due to their overuse in media. For example, there was supposed to be a plot involving robots taking over the world, which at this point, and even arguably back when the show was first being pitched, is a pretty done-to-death concept. I really respect this type of approach to creativity. A problem that a lot of artists have is they'll come up with an idea for something, shelve it for many years, and then go back to it when the concept is no longer fresh or relevant. This was something that both Tartakovsky and his co-writer Derek Bachman kept in mind with Unicorn Warriors Eternal, which I really commend them for doing. In a day and age where new ideas are scarce and everybody just wants to reboot their old shows, I'm really happy to see this team trying their hardest to deliver something fresh and new, rather than creating an unnecessary reboot of Dexter's Laboratory or something. Oh god, I feel like I just tempted fate by saying that. But okay, so Unicorn Warriors Eternal was made with pure intentions, but how does the show itself hold up on its own merits? Visually speaking, like I said, it's stunning, and the show really gets you invested in the world it creates. There is so much life pumping out of every building, backdrop, and character expression or action that it really makes you care about its setting. The question is whether or not it makes you care about what's happening within the setting. A common issue when creating a high-concept television show like this is that it often takes time to warm up to the characters, as you need to build on them at the same time that you're building on the world itself. Television characters in general tend to naturally become more developed over time anyway, and when you're trying to understand them on top of understanding the setting itself, the beginning stages of its progression can feel a little bit slower than some other shows. Does Unicorn Warriors Eternal fall into this trap with slow initial character development? In a lot of ways, yes, and the characters do seem to be the main criticism among the show's detractors. For me, the first few episodes did make me care about certain character conflicts, particularly the relationship between Melinda the Sorceress and Emma, the woman whose body she was put into. What's interesting in this dynamic is that both Melinda and Emma are not only fighting over who gets to control the body, but also the mind. Due to the merge, they're both experiencing amnesia from their past lives, causing painful memories to arise and be revealed to the other person. It makes for a very strong foundation for their emotional journeys. Thankfully, this is pretty much the main conflict within the show, so the fact that it was the first one that I was able to care about really helped my experience. You could argue that Emma and Melinda aren't the most interesting characters on their own, and you would have a point there, at least at first. A lot of their backstories are more thoroughly revealed throughout their memories returning, which did eventually make me care about them more on a personal level. The other main characters didn't do much for me at first either. Seng, the cosmic monk, was put into the body of a child named Alfie, which caused him to be a lot more rambunctious and playful. His personality is meant to provide a little bit of levity from the rest of the main cast, which the character does admittedly accomplish, albeit without really going through any significant character arc. He's a serviceable character who is entertaining at times, but I definitely found his powers more interesting than his personality, which is not really a good thing. Then we get to the character I had the most complicated reaction to, that being Eldred. For the first half of the season, Eldred was my least favorite character by far. He seemed a lot more one-note and less conflicted than the other two members of his team, not to mention being the least interesting when it comes to his actual powers. Eldred did find himself in the body of another person, but this did little if anything to change his personality, which I found far less interesting than the other two. My opinion of Eldred totally changed when we got to the 7th episode, which really delved into his history and told a powerful story that brought new layers to him. That continued throughout the rest of the season, as we get flashbacks into Eldred's past that better contextualize his motivations, as well as the formation of the group itself. I'd even go as far as to say that my opinion totally flipped, and he became my favorite character by the end of the season. There are other side characters that show up throughout the show, such as Merlin the Wizard, the robot named Copernicus, or Emma's fiancé Winston. Some people have criticized the dynamic between Winston and Eldred as being a typical love triangle, but I don't personally agree. Winston and Eldred are not in love with the same person. One's in love with Emma, and the other's in love with Melinda, so I don't even really consider it a love triangle at all. They're both trying to fight for the person they love, who just so happens to be trapped in the same body as another person. I find this to be a much more engaging twist than a by-the-numbers love triangle. Winston and Merlin also do get a lot of development later, but I won't get into that too much to avoid spoilers. I was definitely appreciating the series from the first episode, mostly for its visuals, setting, and action sequences, but I wasn't totally invested in the story yet. Still, I gave it a shot, and by the time I had reached the 5th episode, I was starting to get a lot more into it. Then, as I alluded to previously, the show absolutely blew my mind with the 7th episode entitled The Heart of the Kings. This episode was 33 minutes long instead of around 22 like the rest, and it was by far my favorite episode of the season, although the last few episodes were really good too. If you're going into the show expecting to instantly love it because Primal was so good, I totally get that mentality. However, I'd say maybe temper your expectations a little bit, as I don't think this is a series where you're going to get immediate gratification from episode 1. I do think it's worth it to stick with it though, as once the show did get going, I was hooked. It's also important to keep in mind that many of these issues befall a lot of shows on their first seasons when they're still trying to find their voice. Overall, I really liked Unicorn Warriors Eternal. I will admit, this is far from the best thing that Tartakovsky has ever done, as it has nothing on Primal or what I've seen of Samurai Jack, but the man has set a very high bar for himself. It does have flaws, as the dialogue isn't always the greatest, and the voice acting is pretty unprofessional. That is with the exception of Grey Delisle, who plays a few side characters and is great as always. Those flaws weren't enough to ruin the experience for me, and even at its weakest, the show is highly creative and has beautiful visuals. If you, like me, are sick of all the redundant reboots, remakes, and sequels that come out nowadays, and you're looking for a new IP that is made with passion and talent, Unicorn Warriors Eternal does certainly fall into that category despite its issues. I think that that's something that can be really respected even if the show itself doesn't connect with you. This, much like Primal, is the type of thing I want to see networks and studios become more comfortable with greenlighting, so if you haven't checked it out yet, I definitely recommend doing so. Tartakovsky has stated that he pitched Unicorn Warriors Eternal as a 4-season series. While it's unclear whether this is still planned to be the case or not, he has talked about how the show could develop in future installments. Due to its premise, the subsequent seasons could be set in a completely different time period and have the characters be awakened in different people, totally changing the show's premise and their personalities. I like this idea rather than carrying out the characters' journeys past the point where it's necessary to do so. That's part of the reason I'm happy Primal was announced to be an anthology series going forward, rather than dragging out its one story indefinitely. That being said, the season finale of Unicorn Warriors Eternal ends on a pretty crazy cliffhanger, so I think it's safe to say that we'll be following these characters for a little while, so long as the show gets renewed, that is. Wherever it goes in its second season, I can almost guarantee I'll be there for the ride, especially if it continues to keep getting better like the first season did. There's so much potential to explore here, and I'd hate to see that go to waste. Tartakovsky also has the third season of Primal on the horizon, as well as a recently announced movie called Fixed, so I can definitely say I'm very hyped for whatever else the man has in store.